everybody. I'm Jennifer Siegel. I'm the professor of history here at The Ohio State University. And on behalf of my colleagues, Professors Rick Herman and Peter Mansour, with whom I co-direct the American Foreign and Military Policy Research Cluster here in the Mershon Center, I'd like to thank you all for joining us in our virtual Mershon Center for International Security Studies for what promises to be an informative and stimulating discussion on contemporary Russian policy and power. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would just like to remind everyone of what you already know at this point, 1 year into the pandemic and 1 year into our collective lives on Zoom. Today's session is being conducted as a webinar. Please use the Q&A function, and only the Q&A function, to pose any questions that you may have for Professor Stoner. The chat function will not be monitored during this talk, and I will be pulling from the questions in the Q&A after Professor Stoner finishes her presentation. I promise to try as hard as I can to get to as many questions as possible. Now I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Kathryn Stoner. Kathryn Stoner is the Deputy Director at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University and a Senior Fellow at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law and the Center on International Security and Cooperation at the Freeman Spogli Institute. She teaches in the Department of Political Science at Stanford and in the Program on International Relations, as well as in the Masters in International Policy program. She holds a BA and an MA in political science from the University of Toronto and a PhD in government from Harvard. And in 2016, she was awarded an honorary doctorate from Iliad State University in Tbilisi, Georgia. And I can only hope that that came with a lifetime supply of satsivi and khachapuri and khinkali. Maybe we can hear about that in the Q&A. In addition to many articles and book chapters on contemporary Russia that she has written, she is the author or co-editor of 6 books. The most recent, of course, is the book about which she is going to be speaking to us today, Russia Resurrected, Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order, which is hot off the Oxford University presses. It's really, I feel like we are very privileged to be amongst the first groups of people to whom she will be speaking after the book has been published. We're thrilled that Professor Stoner has agreed to join us, to share with us her work and her ideas. And without further ado, please join me in virtually welcoming Kathryn Stoner.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I'm hoping everyone can hear me, so let me know if you can't. I'm going to share my screen and say thank you, especially to Peter Mansour for inviting me, and Jennifer for hosting, and Kelly Whitaker for setting this up. I wish I was there in person, but this is the world we live in for a little while longer anyway. So I'm going to count on you all to tell me if you cannot see my screen. But assuming, if I hear nothing, then I will assume you can. As Jennifer mentioned, this is a book that is actually almost still warm off the presses from Oxford. It came out February 1st, and it is available on Amazon in time for a lovely St. Patrick's Day present. It is controversially, or provocatively, I should say, called Russia Resurrected, Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order. And I will warn you in advance to set your expectations. I'm going to try and speak for only 35 or 40 minutes. I fear I'll go over that. And then we get to have questions. And I believe we have an hour and a half. So, okay. So, there's a paradox in the perceptions of Russian power. And so on the one hand, you have Mr. Putin saying these things over time, that Russia was never so strong as it wants to be and never so weak as it is thought to be. And here he's actually paraphrasing Winston Churchill, who is paraphrasing a lot of other people. And then Putin in 2008 saying, at last, Russia has returned to the world as a strong state a country that others will heed and that can stand up for itself. He made that statement as Russia won the right to hold the Olympics in 2014. And then this more recent statement in front of the Russian parliament, saying that in just 30 years, we have undergone changes that have taken centuries in other countries. So boasting about the developmental path and speed of Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. There are conflicting perceptions of Russia in the United States as well. I'm gonna reduce this. On the one hand, the perception that Russia is not a peer power, that it is weak, a gas station masquerading as, whoops, it should say country, not untry there, by John McCain in 2014, a gas station with nukes, Mitt Romney paraphrasing McCain in 2015, and Barack Obama saying it's a regional power, threatening its neighbors not out of strength, but out of weakness. This was a particularly not well-received statement by Mr. Putin himself. On the other hand, we have the perception within the United States that Russia is an existential threat. Here's Phil Breedlove, then the Supreme Commander of NATO at Stanford at the time in 2015, at the same time as these other statements are being made, saying Russia is rewriting the Cold War settlement using force. His colleagues in the military proclaiming Russia as an existential threat to the United States in the same year. And then most recently, President Biden, when he was running for office last fall, saying, I think the biggest threat to America right now in terms of breaking up our security and our alliances is Russia. Secondly, I think the biggest competitor is China. But here seeing Russia as much more of a peer power. So there are these conflicting perceptions, and that is one of the goals of the book, and how I started this project is thinking about, well, is Russia strong or weak, and how would we know? And here we are in 2021, 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, having this conversation. And as I will explain as the talk goes on, it's a bit surprising to even be having this conversation, given the starting point of where Russia was in 1991. So is Russia a global power now? And most people would probably say no. I'm going to try and convince you otherwise by relying on some of the data of where Russia is around the world. Just a quick review of Russia's disruptions internationally, really beginning since 2014 and the seizure of Crimea from Ukraine and this low boil war that continues on Ukraine's border. It is the policy of the United States not to recognize Crimea as part of Russia, but still part of Ukraine. But de facto, it has become part of Russia. In 2015, a very quick and effective mobilization on the part of the Russian military into Syria, fundamentally changing the facts on the ground and working with Iran to maintain Bashar al-Assad in Syria. 2016, US presidential election interference, as well as interference with the Brexit referendum later. 2017, giving about $7 million to Marine Le Pen as she prepared for her bid for the French presidency. Continuous buzzing of US warships, that's actually continuing right up until now with Russian planes. In 2018, 2019, the promotion of populism in Eastern Europe and beyond. And then even most recently in 2020, this SolarWinds software hack where Russian hackers working for the Russian government appeared to plant code into the software of this very popularly used software used within the United States government and Fortune 500 companies. We don't know if it's still there and what they gained exactly yet from that. So clearly very, very disruptive. So here are just a few quick facts on Russia. Has 146.7 million people. I'll let you read these rather than my just reciting it. It is, if we don't count Crimea, It has about 144.5 million people. Long term, it's not grabbing countries is probably not the best strategy for increasing population. Until recently, Russia's population growth was negative due to demographic issues, which I'll go into a bit later. But it has recovered pre-COVID at least, and we'll see exactly how it comes out of the COVID crisis. But of course, we've all suffered from the COVID crisis, the US perhaps more than others, although it's not clear. GDP per capita at purchasing power parity, that's what PPP here means, in 2019 was just over $29,000. The important thing is that's about 3 times what it was in 1991. And it's roughly now, if you want to think about purchasing power parity, it looks more like a Greece or a Spain. The US is 56,000, just over that, as you can see. It is an economy of about $1.7 trillion, which is roughly similar to Canada's. So just for perspective, here's the US, here's China, and Germany. So, you know, not the biggest economy. Obviously, ours is much larger, as is China's. It's still primarily commodity driven, but it's not exactly a gas station with nukes, as Romney said. In 2020, Russia was still the world's second largest exporter of oil, and in exchanges places with Saudi Arabia on that. Russia exports about 11.4% of global oil. It also is a huge natural gas exporter, 18% of the world's exports, and nickel, also in large volumes, and number 2, as I said, producer of petroleum products, actually behind the US in this case. So the US doesn't export our oil, but Russia and Saudi Arabia are the biggest exporters. It's the number 1 wheat producer in the world, which Russians are particularly proud of now, especially as they look back at the history of famines in the Soviet period and where they were in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. It has become over time less dependent on revenue from oil exports. I don't want to overstate that, but there have been some attempts at diversification to modest effect. But it has fallen as a percentage of revenue. Sometimes over time that has been a result of declining demand for these products, of course, but there is also the result of some diversification. Okay, so those are our quick facts. So in common comparisons, I think people like Mitt Romney and John McCain are thinking of these sorts of comparisons when they dismiss Russia as not a peer power. Here's GDP. Just I put what I said earlier here in chart form so you can see it easily in trillions of US dollars in terms of, and you can see Russia doesn't look like, I'm using the United Kingdom here as kind of a proxy for Europe in general, although they wouldn't want that anymore, I realize. In terms of population, also a fraction, of course, especially of China's, less than half of ours here in the United States. And even you know, bigger though than the United Kingdom. And in terms of military spending, another common thing we look at or is commonly trotted out as a proxy for global power or influence in US dollars, 2018 US dollars, Russia spends about 1/10 of what the US does, about 1/4 of what China does, and about what the United Kingdom spends. As we'll see later, Russia gets a little more money, a little more for its money, though, than the United Kingdom, even though spending in adjusted dollars it looks roughly the same. And again, just reviewing some of those measures. So if you know, Russia doesn't, by these conventional sort of measures or rough estimates of power, if we added these up and arranged the world along these measures, Russia would not look particularly influential in the world. And yet it's done all those things that I referred to earlier, particularly since Mr. Putin returned to the Russian presidency in 2012. So often it's said that that Russia under Mr. Putin is just it's punching above its weight, right? He is some sort of strategic genius, and he uses what little they have to great effect. And my book tries to offer some correctives on how we think about that, and whether Russia's punching above its weight or whether it's actually a heavyweight in some areas. And this forces us, hopefully, to think a little bit more about state power in international relations, how we measure it, how we define it. And so one of the arguments is that we're thinking about power too narrowly, and as a result, we overlook other capabilities. We need to look beyond those traditional measures I just showed you of men, military, and money. Population size doesn't necessarily translate into global influence. It might. How much you spend on the military doesn't necessarily translate into global influence, and having the world's largest economy would certainly be helpful in global influence, but it alone doesn't seem to reflect relative power. Otherwise, why would Russia, with a relatively small economy, be as disruptive as it has been? So I argue that power is multidimensional, it's relative, and it's contextual. A good hand, for example, in the game of bridge is a bad one at poker. And here I'm using the sort of David Baldwin's perception of power here. A country's power tools can be good enough to be very disruptive depending on the context. And that is one of the main reasons I think we underestimate Russian power and influence and its capacity to disrupt global politics. The second corrective I make is that the characterization of Russia as weak and having nothing is outdated. Russia has recovered and maintained some of the capacities that it had, that the Soviet Union had, more than we appreciate. It has modernized more than we appreciate. It has some new tools of international power that are not that expensive, but extremely disruptive. So if we're just counting up the number of soldiers in the military or the amount of spending on the military, we're missing some of those tools. And in particular, those are so-called soft and sharp power tools. But even hard power, its military has been reformed, as we'll see, since 2008. And then finally, one of the things that enables Russia to use what it has, these new tools, is its domestic political system. And that Russia's lack of international or institutional checks enable President Putin to use the power tools that they have quickly and without much accountability, at least for now. There's also a very high tolerance for risk, and that's quite distinctive from how the Soviet Union functioned, where there were institutions that could check the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Khrushchev, after all, was kicked out of power. There was a coup against Gorbachev. There are no such institutions that really check Mr. Putin anymore. So one of the underlying arguments too is that there's something specific about Putinism and the system that has developed while he has been in power the last 20 years. Okay, so what game is Putin playing? There's a common argument among realists in particular, like Robert Mershon, saying that this is a great power doing what great powers do. That is, Russia has always been a great power. Its geography is essentially its destiny. It covers essentially a continent. As a realist, his argument would be that the game they're playing is power maximization for its own sake. And as I said, it implies that geography, the relative size of the country, its resource endowments determine its foreign policy interests and winners and losers. So if that's true, then Russian behavior should be immutable over time and across regime type. Shouldn't matter if it's a Putin or a Yeltsin or a Gorbachev or a Tsar Nicholas II. It's structurally determined, Russian foreign policy behavior. So by this reckoning, Russia is doomed to be against the West, regardless of who is in power. But given that we have more of everything, remember that chart I showed you, Russia really shouldn't be that much of a threat. It's trying, but it's not much of a threat. But it is a significant threat. Recall what Breedlove said about Russia trying to rewrite the Cold War settlement using force, or Adierno saying it's an existential threat, or Joe Biden saying that in terms of our national security, it's the biggest threat. So all of this sort of led me to think, as I was thinking about how to think about Russia, relatively speaking, was to look and see what has been written about power in international politics. And surprisingly, it's not that much since the 1950s, or not that much new. Not that there isn't a lot written about it, but it's still, you know, the definition that Bob Dahl trotted out in the 1950s is still pretty much the dominant definition, and that's the one I use here. And it's the ability of one state to get another to do something that it might not otherwise do. And of course, power is relative. So in the book, I look at power in three dimensions. First is the kind of traditional one of men, military, and money, that is means. But I also move to consider context of power too. Thinking about, as David Baldwin does in some of his work, power over whom to do what. And again, a good-handed bridge is a bad one at poker. And you don't bring a knife to a gunfight, right? So we need to also consider context, and we need to consider things like geographic domain. Where and how many countries does Russia actually exercise influence, which I use interchangeably as power, with power. And we have to think about its policy scope and how weighty an actor it is in that policy area. How much does it matter, and in what areas? So for example, in oil, Russia is a very weighty actor, and since 80% of global energy still comes from carbon sources like oil and natural gas, then you know, Russia's weighty in a really important a policy area. That would differentiate it from a state like North Korea, that has, for example, growing means in terms of its nuclear capacity, we think, but a pretty limited geographic domain. And its policy scope and weight isn't important beyond the fact that it has those nuclear weapons and can really affect its neighbors with them and with its activities in that area. So I produced this crude artistic rendering of what I'm talking about in terms of these different dimensions of power, and try to imagine that these circles can get bigger or smaller. So you could have a lot of means in terms of a strong economy, you know, a healthy society, well-educated, a strong military, and lots of push and pull influence, which I'll explain, over other countries, but in a really narrow geographic area. You could have a very limited policy scope if it's also only in one policy area, like nuclear weapons. So these things can independently vary as well. But I look along these different dimensions. And so this is, in a sense, the way the book is organized. So is Russia resurrected? My argument is Russia has the geographic domain, policy scope, and weight in certain important policy areas, and in many areas, the means that are sometimes overlooked. It has enough power beyond means alone, that is that chart I showed you, right, of men, military, and money, to be disruptive and sometimes decisive in international politics. So why or how has this happened? Well, that's the second part of the argument, and that looks more at domestic politics. Most of my work has been in the domestic, on Russian domestic politics. So the argument here is that Putin has the will to use what Russia has now pretty much unconstrained, as I mentioned. Why is this? Well, because the deployment of those power resources abroad is determined by politics in Russia at home. And I think when we think about what Russia is doing abroad, sometimes we forget about what goes on at home, and Russia has politics too. Its domestic politics really drive Russian foreign policy as much or more than those fixed structural interests like geography, for example, and location. So the type of regime matters in determining Russian foreign policy decisions and the deployment of its power resources. And in terms of policy recommendations or outcomes for the United States, there's something about Putinism at home and Russia's exercise of its foreign policy tools. So one thing I do in the book is kind of run the counterfactual. What if Putin wasn't in power? What if the regime was not an autocracy? And in fact, there are historical counterfactuals to this. And I argue that Russia at different times, if we think back to Gorbachev between 1985 and 1991, we have Russia actually having good relationships with the West, right? Russia is negotiating at this period under Gorbachev, whom I bet many of you still think of as kind of warm and snuggly. He just turned 90, by the way. There's he's alive and kicking. Where we, there are famous pictures of him walking with Reagan and George H.W. Bush after signing arms control agreements, arms reduction agreements in the nuclear area that we had not seen before. Then in comes Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first popularly elected president. When we had the Bill and Boris show with Bill Clinton and Yeltsin, Clinton helping Russia join the G8. There were some rough spots in terms of NATO expansion, but also tremendous improvement also in being able to negotiate out of those disagreements. And then even in Putin's first two terms between 2000 and 2008, the first one being 2000, 2004, then 2004 to 8, Putin is purportedly the first international leader to call George W. Bush in 2001 after 9/11 to express his condolences on behalf of the Russian people for our loss that day. Putin, by some accounts, including Angela Stent at Georgetown, was disappointed that there was that he had thought at the time that there would be more coordination in terms of an international terrorism problem, that Russia also had this coming out of Chechnya, and had hoped that he could work together more with the United States. And in fact, there were periods of working strongly together. Remember that when Putin's protege, Dmitry Medvedev, was a Russian president from 2008 to 12, Putin was his prime minister. And so during this period, the so-called reset in US-American relations, Putin, of course, was involved, right? He approved these things that Medvedev cooperated on with the United States. And what were those things? Well, first, the New START agreement that has just been renewed last month, reducing or capping the number of strategic nuclear weapons that the United States and Russia can have. And it includes also a very sophisticated verification regime. Another thing, of course, was the Northern Distribution Network, which probably a lot of Americans don't appreciate existed, but it was Russia allowing us to send military equipment through its territory on trains into bases in Central Asia that we were renting with Russian approval at the time. Even though those are sovereign states, Russia has certain influence over them, and enabling us to stage those weapons in those bases into Afghanistan when Pakistan was not as reliable a neighbor. And then the final thing Medvedev did was he abstained on behalf of Russia or he gave orders to in the UN Security Council over NATO's actions in Libya to oust Muammar Gaddafi, or at least intervene in the civil war there. In comes Putin, though, back into the presidency in 2012, and it's at that point we see the reset and relationships with the West change radically, and Russian foreign policy become more aggressive. And so, a puzzle is why did that happen? And the book touches on this as well. So, oops, didn't mean to do that. I got a little trigger happy with my mouse here. So there is a new geography of Russian power, and as much as I agreed with Barack Obama in some areas in calling Russia a regional power, that was obviously wrong. Russia, and it's certainly wrong today. It was maybe more correct in 2014 or 2015 when he said it, but it's certainly not the case today. Now, Russia does have a geographic domain that it inherited from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union inherited much of that from the Russian Empire before it. So, it is the largest country in the world, geographically speaking. It spans both Europe and Asia. It has the highest number of international borders of any other country in the world. That is 14. The only other country actually that does have the same number is China. It borders with countries that used to be within the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. That I think has helped to perpetuate this idea of a zone of natural influence, historical influence that can be reclaimed. But since 2014 in particular, it has built other areas of significant global influence. I think sometimes we underestimate what Russia has gained in terms of its global influence and capabilities through its actions in Syria. It's not a quagmire for Russia because they don't, the Russian leadership doesn't think the same way about political power and international action or effectively occupation of a country as we do. There's not as much pressure to fix it now that it's broken. Russia's also developed influence in Iraq, in Iran, as well as Saudi Arabia, which has a somewhat difficult relationship with, but very cooperative in terms of OPEC, which is now OPEC plus. It has new relationships with Israel, partly because of the huge Russian diaspora there. It maintains relationships with these very difficult countries in, for example, the Middle East, or countries that have difficult relationships, pardon me, with one another. So, you know, Iran and Iraq don't get along particularly well. Saudi Arabia and Iran don't get along particularly well, but Russia deals with all of them. It also has established relationships with individual countries and leaders who have kindred spirits or who have populations who may be receptive to sort of a new kind of, I wouldn't call it quite an ideology, but beliefs, conservative beliefs, more traditional beliefs. And so we can see this in the populist leaders who have emerged in Hungary, for example, Viktor Orban, Marine Le Pen in France, but among societies in the Middle East, North Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa that see this as an alternative to liberalism, for example. And one of the important things I think too to recognize is that Russia does not use ideology the way the Soviet Union did. There's much more pragmatism. They're not trying to spread an ideology per se, but they do have this sort of emphasis on traditional values and also not pressing hard on things like human rights in their dealings with maybe countries that would have unsavory sort of perception on the part of the United States or other Western powers. So as I mentioned, in terms of influence abroad that under Putin, Russia has amassed in the last, really since about 2012, 13 to present, I mentioned that there's this increasing influence and sharper, closer ties in Eastern Europe with countries like Serbia and Hungary, as they take a turn more toward authoritarianism than toward Russia has developed closer and closer ties. Varied friends in the Middle East, which I mentioned, Western Europe. Russia is a very weighty and important actor in terms of oil supply and in particular natural gas. And so right now we're having a little set to with Germany over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that goes from just west of St. Petersburg into northern Germany, supplying natural gas. That's absolutely vital to Germany, which is increasingly dependent on Russia for its natural gas, getting up high into the 90% of its natural gas comes from Russia. What is that used for? Heating, electricity. Effectively could shut down their economy if you shut down natural gas. So it creates a vulnerability. That's our concern. In South America, Russia basically now owns Venezuelan oil. It has taken an ownership stake in Venezuela National Oil Company, closer ties to with Argentina. I'm just doing a very quick tour, but in chapter 3 of the book, it's a bigger tour. thicker tour. Russia has also developed a military presence in the Arctic. It has the largest fleet in the world of icebreakers, including nuclear icebreakers that we don't have or Canada doesn't have. Two other big presence in the Arctic. And this is in part for exploration of new oil and gas resources. In the past, American oil companies have partnered with Russian oil and gas entities in order to explore that. Russia has been able now to replace, because remember they're under sanctions over Ukraine and their hacking from us and from Europe. They've been able to replace Western investors, not completely, but to a large degree, with investment from the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as well as China and even India, in terms of trying to do more exploration in the Arctic. And China is particularly interested in a new northern trade route through the Arctic as global warming opens up that as a possibility. So working with Russia there. Russia's also been, in the last 3 or 4 years, particularly savvy in terms of developing new markets for its products, which are not just oil and gas, but also selling nuclear power facilities for domestic energy purposes, building materials and mining materials. When you go into Target and you don't see consumer products, for example, that are stamped made in Russia, that's because they don't really make a lot of great or high quality consumer products. Instead, they tend to focus more on heavy industry. But they've been relatively savvy in terms of forgiving loans in countries in sub-Saharan Africa who had gotten into debt in the Soviet period. And so those loans were probably bad anyway. They weren't going to be repaid, and instead Russian companies have received contracts for supplying material and so in this way, again, finding new markets, getting around Western sanctions, while at the same time sometimes providing loans to these places, or, as I said, doing business. It's an alternative, and there's some quotes in the book about this, to the West, where Russia's willing to do business without a lot of strings attached. So they're not going to come down hard on human rights abuses in Central African Republic. Instead, what they're going to do, and what they did do, is go in, use mercenaries, provide a rough settlement to a civil war there, and then help them market diamonds and take some money off the top. The same is true with precious metals. In terms of Russia and China, there's some juicy stuff in there, which is actually going to develop a new project on this because it's so interesting. Of Russian-Chinese relations. Russia supplies China, of course, with oil. China gets it from other places and has its own domestic oil industry too, but it also provides sort of infrastructure products to help China with its own oil and gas infrastructures, as well as supplying China with military equipment. That comes with long chains of servicing. It's hard to just get rid of a jet. You need someone to come in and help you with it, as well as cooperating with China in military exercises, which have been largely Russian-led and Russian-dominated. The Chinese not taking a huge role in that, so it can't be overstated. Just quickly, Russia has also developed close ties with India. This is somewhat of a legacy of the Soviet period, but also a result of Russia looking at India, seeing a huge market there that is an alternative to Western markets where Russia is under sanction, has been under sanction since 2014. They cooperate on pharmaceuticals, for example. So Sputnik V for victory. The Russian COVID vaccine is, for example, being manufactured in India, some of it. And India has just registered it, and so it'll go into arms in India as well. By the way, I would take Sputnik V if it is perfectly reliable. I think Russian leadership undermined perceptions of its reliability because they weren't completely forthcoming when they first came up with it in in terms of data, but over time we've seen that it appears to be just as efficacious, and is actually part of Russia's vaccine diplomacy now, sort of soft power, use of soft power around the world. It's shipped or registered, pardon me, its vaccine Sputnik V in about 48 countries as of today. All right, so in terms of geography, it's become, and I just gave you a very quick and selective tour there. In terms of geography, Russia has greatly expanded its spheres of influence. In terms of its policy scope and weight in those policy areas, that is its importance, as I mentioned earlier, it's increased and changed that significantly since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's primarily based on economic interests and geoeconomic calculations. But there's really three main areas of policy that Russia is interested in globally. So first, obviously, oil and gas and energy more generally. But it isn't just the actual physical products of oil and gas where Russia is an important actor globally. It's pipelines and infrastructure, transportation infrastructure control in particular. So one of the things that Russia's gained out of the Syrian conflict is control over pipelines in northern Syria and increased support of pipeline infrastructure development in northern Iraq as well, where we of course shed our own blood and tears and money. In terms of non-carbon trade, Russia is the world's second largest purveyor of weaponry. We're number one. But also nuclear energy technology for domestic purposes. It has become increasingly competent in terms of agriculture. And one of the reasons I think we should sort of focus on that, if you know Russian geography, it's hard to grow things in many parts of that country, probably most parts of it. But the fact that it now exports wheat, given historically how difficult it was even to feed their own people in the Soviet period, but even at times in the imperial period, is a notable accomplishment. There was a really interesting article in the New York Times Magazine a couple of months ago about how Russia will gain, actually, in some ways from climate change. And one of them is increasing its arable land and being able to grow more and more things. And then finally, the third main area of policy, of course, is national security, protecting its borders, its sovereignty, and moving into the Arctic. And it is the predominant power now in the Arctic. So those are chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 1, obviously, an introduction and overview of the book. Chapter 4, 5, 6, and 7 all look at the means of Russian power. And those are some of the more traditional measures, first of all. So looking at the economy as kind of an unsteady basis of Russian global influence, looking at society as well, assessing it as a relative strength or weakness in sustaining global influence, comparing military power, and in particular, the book provides an overview of Russia's new look military reform that was begun initially in 2008, and has, as well as providing direct comparisons to China and the United States and Europe in that chapter on military power and capability. The conclusion there is that Russia is the most powerful in terms of military power, hands down, in Europe, and is, by many measures, a peer power with the United States, especially in nuclear power, nuclear weaponry. Sorry. And then Chapter 7 looks at soft and so-called sharp power, which hopefully I'll have time to get into, but that is the power of attraction to the Russian perspective. And then sharp power, the sort of ability to use cyber and media means to disrupt an information environment in military speak. So how things started, and I think this is one of the things when we think about, that quote that Putin gave us back in 2002, where he was paraphrasing Churchill, as Russia is never as weak as thought and never as strong as it wants to be. It was pretty weak at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So looking first at the economy, recall that it was a complete collapse of the political structure and of the economic structure. That planning system that had developed from the mid-1920s onward falls apart, and the economy, it goes into extreme shortage and then hyperinflation, and is dependent on loans from the International Monetary Fund. They're even in the early 1990s, 91, 92, receiving food aid. I actually was the beneficiary. I'm not proud of this. I'm not sure why I'm telling you, but I was the beneficiary of USAID food aid on the street in Moscow, because it had made its way onto the black market, and so I had some frozen chicken paid for by the American taxpayer, with the price jacked up on the streets of Moscow. But it was a terrible economic catastrophe. It has been called by others, Anders Osland, as one of the worst economic catastrophe outside of wartime in history, except now I think for Venezuela, we could say. So really at the bottom of the barrel, a recipient of loans from lenders of last resort, unemployment, something new for post-Soviet citizens who had never faced this before. In terms of its gross domestic product, comparing Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa is often included, with the EU 28 and the United States in this time period, the first 25 years or so. You can kind of see where Russia fits in terms of its GDP. Here it is, comparatively speaking. Here's China. Look at the takeoff there. Here's the European Union, 28. So this includes Britain, I'm sorry. I think I said this was Russia. This is India, of course, and this is the United States. So Russia is here. So you can see it's increasing, but it's traveling along with Brazil, and it is not the rocket ship that China is in this period. That's just GDP. That's not per capita or per person. Here it is per capita, and if we look at that, it's not as bad looking. It actually does a lot. It's here in the brown, in the middle brown here. So again, we have the United States up here. This is purchasing power parity. So if you went and bought the same basket of goods in one country versus the other, what it would actually feel like relative to your income. So you can see that Russia is actually doing reasonably well here in that sense, at per capita, at purchasing power parity. Here's China per capita, right? Because it has a bigger population, at purchasing power parity. Russia is actually a richer country than China, and I think that sometimes is underappreciated. People just look at the gross Chinese economy and not actually the standard, comparative standard of living. Obviously improving in China, but here's the European Union and here's the United States. Okay. There's been a recent decreased reliance in Russia on carbon-based energy exports, as I mentioned earlier. Part of this is that there's a drop in prices, right? So they're not, but even if you control for that, this is a % of total exports, but even if you control for that, you can see that there still is less revenue coming in there. There's a separation here of gross domestic product and global crude oil prices in Russia. This happens around 2014. Partly it's, yes, there's a dip in global oil prices here. Partly it's some money that goes in to hold up the ruble, but even still, the Russian economy recovers and grows. So there is still this big decoupling. Why? Here again, this is just a snapshot, and want to be careful not to overstate this, but the structure of exports in 2013, that year, and 2017, so here oil prices have recovered and about the same, has changed. 70% are carbon and energy based exports, and here it's 59%, so it's dropped. What's come up are metals and metal products. A little bit has increased in terms of machinery and equipment. This would reflect some of Russian activities in the Middle East, picking up new contracts. Chemicals and rubbers, pharmaceuticals, even look, food and agriculture has doubled. So we're seeing some incremental changes in diversification. That said, the book goes into a lot of detail on how Russia's underspending relative to other countries in terms of research and development, and education more generally in terms of having high quality education as opposed to just the highest number in the world of engineers. It's what are those engineers trained to do. In terms of society, the book goes into, in another chapter, life expectancy, which is pretty low. Male life expectancy is particularly worrisome, and the gap between female and male life expectancy is worrisome. But this has gotten better over time. So Russians are now wealthier, as I just mentioned, than they've ever been, living longer than they've ever been. Now, this is pre-COVID, and we're in the middle, or hopefully at the end, but we don't know yet where we will be with COVID. So they're as unhealthy as they are relative to others, they're getting better, and it's better relative to where they've been. The healthcare system is improving, but it's not perfect yet. It is leading causes of death are preventable diseases, cardiovascular disease. The problem is people die younger. That's the leading cause of death here in the United States too. But there is some competency in the Russian government. There's tremendous corruption, which the book talks about as well. But there's some competency in certain policy areas, and one has been actually in getting people to drink less. I know what you're all thinking. Russians drink still more liters of vodka than the rest of Europe, but it's closer in terms of that amount. Russians are also the heaviest smokers in the world per capita, but they've also attacked that. They were the heaviest smokers. That has also come down. So it's not as though the Russian state doesn't know this. And Putin understands this to be important, that is longevity and life expectancy, because it's an economic issue, right? People are dying in the prime of life, and where labor productivity should be highest, and so you want to bring that down. That population is relatively highly educated, right? And particularly in technical skills, but one issue is whether or not those skills actually match what the market needs, and so this is something they'll have to work on. Just a reminder, it's only 30 years out since from the complete collapse of the economy and this massive shift for society from a planned system to a form of market system. Corruption obviously is a tremendous problem, and I talk about that in the book as well. Russian society, on the one hand, has some strengths, as this slide shows, but on the other hand, it has these issues, not the least of which is a brain drain, that is highly educated Russians seeming to leave. Some have called it the Putin exodus. But population growth is at least now flat, hovering around flat to slightly negative, but it's not where it was in the 90s. One ongoing problem we can talk about more in questions is young people indicating that they want to leave, and of course young people being out on the streets protesting Putin, most recently over Navalny, but even before that as well. Comparatively, this is just where Russia stands relative to others, and you can see here it was in the 1990s. We get a big dip in life expectancy at birth, but then it starts to go up, still behind the European Union, the United States, even Brazil in this area too. Mortality rates are pretty, this is the death rate. That's problematic for Russia. It's getting better, but this is getting flatter and closer to other countries. Here's Germany, for example, as a proxy for Europe, but still problematic in terms of maintaining demographics that would be positive for the economy. One big challenge societally is inequality, and the economy has gotten increasingly unequal in terms of income distribution, which is what this shows, but perhaps more problematically, wealth distribution. So here you can see the top 1% of the population owning almost 45%, or having almost 45% of the wealth. here's the bottom 50% of the population having are just below 5% of the wealth. That's very problematic. This is one reason you see people coming out on the streets. Some of this is corruption, of course, maybe even a lot of it, and the sort of crony capitalism that has grown up under Putin. The book also then goes into, and I don't want to talk for too much longer, goes into comparisons of Russian hard or military power, soft power, and sharp means of power. Just quick highlights here. Russia has a huge nuclear arsenal, the only country in the world that can deliver an intercontinental ballistic missile to the United States in under 30 minutes. It's, as I mentioned earlier, the military reform new look has largely been completed. It's ended the Russian military's reliance on conscription. There still are conscripts, but it's a much smaller number. In part, this is because of the modernization of equipment that has also occurred. So, you need a certain level of knowledge in order to, accumulated knowledge in order to work that equipment. And so, it's not practical anymore to have a primarily conscript army as a result. The spending that Russia does on its military at purchasing power parity puts it in the top 3 globally. Russia spends, as I said earlier, about what Britain spends in terms of dollar-to-dollar terms on its military, but Russia produces everything inside, and it's paying in rubles. So once you change to purchasing power parity, actually you can explain why Russia has been able to fund a huge military reform, whereas the UK has not. Yet they seem to spend the same in budget terms, in dollar terms. Undoubtedly, the United States is still the biggest military in the world with the most capability in terms of conventional forces. But Russia has become, without a doubt, the most capable military in Europe, period, no question. In terms of Russian soft power, Russia is waging friendship with some countries, which is not what Joe Nye, actually talked to him about this a couple of times because he has a fellowship at Hoover, so he comes out to see us every once in a while at Stanford when we're allowed to see one another. Russia wages friendship. Soft power for Nye is supposed to be a passive thing, right? So think American movies and showing our lifestyle. That is a passive power of attraction to the United States. And to the freedom and political preferences and values we're supposed to represent. States, by the very nature of what it is, don't control soft power. You don't have a soft power policy in Nye's rendering of what it is. But Putin's Russia has a soft power policy. It is an active policy, an active force. In one of their policy documents, it's described as a set of instruments and methods used to achieve foreign policy goals without using the military, but instead changing the information environment and, quote, other instruments of influence. It's a cultural power of attraction, but to Russian policymakers, it's intentional and instrumental. So some things you may not know about. It has established cultural centers for teaching the Russian language in Europe. It makes grants to civil society organizations. It funds foreign students at Russian universities, just as the Soviet Union did. But it funds the Valdai conference, which is run by the presidential administration. That is to basically explain Russian policy positions or explain Russia to experts. So I've attended that, probably some of you in the audience have as well. It has established these institutes on democracy and cooperation, one of which still exists in Paris. The one that existed in New York monitored American democracy. It has this Gorbachev Public Support Fund that again funds non-governmental organizations. And of course, things like the hosting of the Sochi Olympics, the hosting of the World Cup, show Russia to the world as a modern country that has transformed itself. So that's a kind of more traditional kind of soft power. It has reached out to Russian diaspora communities in the world. Israel in particular has a large Russian diaspora community. Putin even paid pensions to those former Russian or Soviet citizens who fought in the Second World War, and had they stayed in Russia would have received them, paid them in Israel. this did a tremendous, it gave him a tremendous boost. He's the only Russian leader to have visited all kinds of places, and one of those is Israel. The other is Saudi Arabia. He's been everywhere. This promotion of social conservatism is attractive to some societies and leaders, in contrast to the overly permissive West. They've employed an array of tools of goodwill, including aid and emergency services in Italy, sending COVID masks and whatnot, when the Europeans were not sharing these things last year in a big From Russia with Love campaign. And now they're undertaking vaccine diplomacy globally. Sharp power, I'm almost at the end here, is using a jab or push to get countries to do what they might not otherwise do. It's not my term. It's used by, among others, Walker and Ludwig. Where soft power is supposed to be power of attraction, sharp power kind of pushes and changes, information sources and the environment to a more favorable view of Russia. So we see this in terms of the cyber attacks on energy networks of their neighbors, even actually cutting off Ukraine's, for example, and affecting Europe as a result. The denial of service attacks, saw that in Estonia, but we've seen it elsewhere too. Bots and trolls used on social media to promote or blunt certain messages, again, changing the information environment. In the US, the 2016 elections, but there are other examples here too, and 2020 with solar winds I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Russia also uses things like RT, Russia Today, which is a slick network that looks like CNN in terms of presentation, maybe even better. And it has a presence in 100 countries across 5 continents, claiming 100 million as a weekly audience. And they're in Europe, Africa, Middle East, also has its YouTube channel. And ironically, its slogan is question more. That is, question more outside of Russia, don't question anything inside Russia. But you could watch it, let's say in Qatar, and not even realize that this is the perspective of the Russian government. Sputnik is the sort of little brother of RT. It broadcasts on the radio in English and other languages and has a very active website. It has, in the book, I give you some examples of where it's beaming into the United States. And it had been very pro-Trump when he was president, without, of course, people who are listening realizing that this is not just a regular radio program, it's the Russian government's perspective. So finally, why does Russia do all of this? And then I promise I'll shut up. Well, the purposes are structural, of course. There is some aspect of that. Every country wants to protect its borders and its sovereignty, and it has, of course, economic interests. It needs to sell things, wheat, arms, chemicals. But there is this interesting counterfactual, right? Would any Russian leader behave this way and use its power in the same way? What's the purpose? So my argument in the book is that there is something specific about Putinism. There's this patronal system that now requires Russia expand, not because of ideology, as it was this case in the Soviet Union, but to support the system itself, to maintain the status quo, maintain stability within society. And we have quotes of him saying exactly this. He is a patron over this kind of cronyistic system that his very closest childhood friends and colleagues that he worked with when he was a KGB officer have benefited the most. So it's uncanny how much money you can make if you're a friend or an old friend of Vladimir Putin's in particular. So he has to distribute rents to this network. His popularity is a political resource, and so he cares about it a lot. If it dips, his control over this network and his own skimming and money that may go to the kind of palace that Navalny found for us and showed us in his documentary shortly after he was arrested. So social mobilization against inequality has to be avoided at all costs. Russia can develop, yes, but it has to be, as Putin said, evolutionary, not revolutionary. So you have to keep society down so that you can basically gain from the state and privatize privatize any gains from that are available from controlling the state, but make the costs of that public. So this Russia under siege narrative, Russia is a great power narrative that's coming out of Russia, helps keep that political resource of popularity high. And this might help explain also why Navalny is such a threat to Putin. But also Russian aggressiveness abroad is gaining it markets, and it helps to maintain the regime's stability without resorting to violence. So the domestic political model is such that society, not NATO, is the biggest threat to Putin's regime. And the longevity of its revival as a global power will be determined by society. Again, why go after someone like Navalny with such seriousness? Why be so aggressive in pushing back against protests? Society is in service to the state, and the state is in service to an elite that both wants to enrich itself while promoting individual and state interests, and they're entwined in Russia. So again, society, the biggest threat, and it must be kept pacified, or failing that, openly repressed. And this may explain why the worry about Navalny, as I said, and Putin's constitutional changes through a pandemic last summer. So does Russia have a grand strategy? If it does, I would say this is what it is. But the question is it a Russian grand strategy, or is it a strategy in foreign policy that is particular to this regime and to maintaining this regime, as opposed to being the interest of any other political actor? I talk in the book about whether a different leader would behave a different way, and I think the answer is yes. We are not stuck in this. It is not inevitable that Russia is against the West. It has historically not always been the case, it is, I think, particular to Putin. So I'm going to stop with that slide, and I'm going to end with a big apology for going on so long. I can't see you, so I'm going to use Zoom as my my excuse on that, but it's just my love of talking about Russia. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, for that really interesting and if long, packed so full with really fascinating insights and information, and I'd like to thank you for all of it. And of course, there are lots of questions that have come in. I want to remind everyone to make sure that you're posing your questions in the Q&A slot, not the chat slot, because I'm looking at the Q&A, not at the chat. So please make sure that's where your questions show up. I'm going to actually resist the urge to take advantage of the host prerogative. I have a question I'm dying to answer, but I'm going to let someone else, a few other people's questions get in there first, because I recognize that absolute power sometimes corrupts, and I don't want to be corrupted in that way. Actually, Kathryn, can you unshare your screen so that everyone can have a better look at Palo Alto behind you? And you're muted too, so if you can unmute yourself as well, that
Sure.
would be,
yep.
that would be great. Thanks so much. So our first question that I'm going to pose from the Q&A comes from Jerry Hudson, who has read Russia Resurrected and is urging all of us, the rest of us who have not yet read it. I've made it through about half of it, but I will agree with Jerry that it is extremely enjoyable, I second his recommendation. But Jerry's question, as Jerry says, that the book in part examines the link between regime type and foreign policy. He says, you contend that the more repressive the regime, the more assertive the foreign policy, using the evolution of Putin's policy to illustrate this proposition. Assuming his understanding is correct, do you think that this relationship holds generally when compared to Soviet history, and then to other nations that also have repressive regimes?
So I don't know that that is 100% true all of the time in all countries, but I think when they're under certain conditions, it's true. And over time, with Soviet history, there's probably something to that as well. We only have 70 years there, but we have only 30 with Russia post-Soviet history. So you could make an argument with World War I that was partly what Nicholas was doing too, right? But I'm not a historian, so I'm not, Jennifer, I'm not going to get into your lane there. But yes, you have the argument basically, yeah, correct there, Jerry, on that point. In terms of other countries with repressive systems, well, I think, when things are not going well at home, I mean, first of all autocracies have to have some degree of domestic legitimacy or be seen that way, right? Or because you can't kill everyone, you can't shoot everyone. I mean, even look at what's happening in Myanmar right now, right? So some of them will turn outward for a narrative that shows them to be kind of, defending by, even though we're being repressive right now, we have to do this to defend the nation against this bigger outside problem. And so I think that's essentially the argument I'm making, is that Putin has to show himself in order to maintain this domestic political system and stability, Russia is under siege. We can't have this kind of instability. You don't want what's happening next door in Ukraine to happen here. That's the most important thing. So, yeah.
Well, moving from Russia turning outwards to outwards pushing back, our next question comes from Dan Beatty, who asks how much of Russian ascension, as he calls it, is due to their working to improve their own position and improving themselves, and how much of it comes as a result of a lack of pushback from other states. He says the West, but
right, yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think it's actually as Putin embarked upon this, it was at a particular, I'm saying Putin, but there is no, I have a colleague here at Stanford who always says there's no Mr. Putin, but as Putin, or there's no Mr. Russia, but as the regime sort of embarked on what I see as a policy change in 2013-14, we're already seeing under Obama this leading from behind policy, right? And then it only gets sort of worse with America First as we begin to withdraw even more internationally. And so we made it easy, certainly, for them to pursue this sort of policy by withdrawing. Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to read the questions.
You're doing a great job.
Pouring in at the same time. I'm going to actually group two questions together because they both are addressing, I think they both relate to what your points on Russian hard power and questions of how much of a threat Russia actually does pose. The first of these two questions comes from John Mueller, who asks, do you think Russia presents what you call a significant threat to US security? Do you agree that it is capable of causing the US to cease to exist? And I'm going to add into that John Schechter's question, which deals with Russian aggressive work, as he calls it, on new nuclear weapons, and the way in which that would disrupt the power balance globally, and tying to John's question specifically vis-a-vis US security.
Yeah, so, okay, so this is a nukes question. These are nukes questions, basically, in general. So, is Russia actually an existential threat? Well, yes, but remember, we're an existential threat to them too, right? So that was, mutually assured destruction was the doctrine that kept us both safe, frankly, right, and deterrence. So, that's still in place. The problem is, and the book goes into this, with Russia, and it hopefully it's just bluffing, but Putin has a tendency, or has developed the tendency to talk rather admiringly of Russian nuclear capabilities, and they view their nuclear, and this isn't just since Putin, but they view their nuclear weapons as protecting their sovereignty, and so very fundamentally important to the survival of the country. But they have seemingly, by some interpretations, in the last 4 or 5 years, altered their nuclear doctrine to seemingly make it okay to use nuclear weapons, either short range or long range, if the I think the quote in the book is quoting their security doctrine, if the integrity of the fatherland is in danger. Okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean if we, or NATO, that is, tried to help Ukraine get Crimea back, would Russia then use a nuclear weapon to stop that? We don't know exactly. Probably not. But they've also developed some, weapons that I think one of the questions was alluding to, like the Poseidon torpedo, which is nuclear powered, nuclear tipped, which allegedly, if it actually worked, and we don't know, it would cause a tsunami of about 1,500 kilometers inland once it hits the shore of its target nation. So, that'd be hugely problematic for the East Coast of the United States. You guys are probably okay there in Ohio. I'm probably not okay here in Palo Alto. We have some mountains. So, that's all very worrisome. And so this is why you do have Joe Biden saying, in terms of our national security, Russia's the biggest threat. In terms of being a competitor, maybe it's China. But yeah, so the other thing I think I may have ended with is time horizons. The issue of time horizons, right, is that Putin's regime sees time quite differently. And so they probably don't, his policies are not thinking past 5, 10, 15 years. And I think this is also important in terms of how we view or assess their ability or desire to take risk. And it seems as though they're much more tolerant than they certainly in the Soviet system.
Ben Lyman asks, if Putin is more interested in evolutionary expansion and domestic stability, is the United States wrong to be so concerned about Russia as a hard power conventional military threat?
Oh, I said evolutionary development, not expansion. Yeah, so there's so that's an important difference because he means evolutionary economic development, which would have which would if you believe modernization theory, which I think is the kind of thing he has in his head, would mean that you get a middle class that starts demanding more things. You'd have people out on the street, and that's what he doesn't want. Global expansion of global influence or disruption, I have no problem with that being quick, and I think we've seen pretty good evidence of that. And it is an under-institutionalized domestic political system that doesn't stop him. He doesn't have a parliament that's going to say you can't do that. Only we can declare war. That's not happening, as it would happen in the United States. I'm not an advocate of dictatorship, which is essentially where we're going here in Russia, but it's pretty, in the long run, we don't know how that long it is, but in the long run, that's an unstable way to govern, especially a country like that. Witness the Bolshevik Revolution, but in the short run, and as I mentioned, time horizons 5 to 15 years maybe, it allows them to do these things and to take huge risks.
I'm going to move us away for, I think, probably not the rest of our time, but for a short period, from questions about hard power and security threats, to a question from Brian Pollins, who asks you to comment on the development of Putin's development of ties to Erdogan and Turkey, and also given the context that Turkey is a part of NATO. You talked about, this is my commentary, of course, we had Russia and India and Russia and China, and you did not have Turkey on your list of.
I was selective, I should have, is that the question you're dying to ask, Jennifer?
That was not the question I was dying to ask.
Okay, no, I'm intrigued by that. Okay. So, no, right, this is Turkey is kind of a frenemy of Russia's historically and a frenemy currently. they had that little awkward issue of shooting down a Russian jet, of course, in I think that was 2016. And there were sanctions against Turkey, and then they made up after the coup attempt against Erdogan, Putin backed Erdogan. So why? I think that has a lot to do with Syria, but it also has a lot to do with pipelines going through Turkey and supplying oil and natural gas into Europe. So this has been a way to get around Ukraine and takes any leverage the Ukrainian government has over Russia by circumventing Ukraine as a path for oil and gas into Europe. So Turkey's important to Russia for that, and Russia's important, and Turkey's important to Russia because, yes, as you mentioned, someone mentioned in the questions, it's a member of NATO so far. What has Turkey done? Well, it's taking missiles. It bought missiles, an anti-ballistic missile system from Russia. And that, as I mentioned earlier, when you buy a system like that, you're also buying Russian engineers and maintenance that will go years, decades, potentially into the future. This is problematic because those are Russians who are doing it in a NATO country. What else are they gaining access to? And so Turkey had been brought into a program to develop jets with NATO and the United States. It's now been taken out of that program as a result. So, I mean, increasingly unreliable ally for the United States. We can call it that yet. But the relationship, the frenemy relationship with Russia is right now stabilized, but I think it's going on.
Like any good frenemy.
Right. Exactly.
Ben Trotter is asking us to look domestically for a little while. And he would like to know if the domestic opposition to Putin claim to differ from him in terms of foreign policy goals or methods.
Well, okay. Well, first of all, there isn't a huge domestic organized opposition, point one. Second, you'd be surprised who thought the whole Crimea thing was a great idea, or who backed it, retroactively. One of those guys is named Gorbachev, and another one's named Navalny. There's that. In terms of opposition that has existed in the past, well, sure, there are people who are opposed to Russia having gone into Syria, as opposed to focusing on infrastructure at home or research and development or improving the educational system. Those people don't win elections in Russia. In fact, the only surprising thing about elections in Russia is that they take place, not who wins at this point, but it's taking more and more effort on the part of the regime and this is why Navalny is such a threat, it was really his smart voter, what he was doing with the smart voter system to get people to vote for anyone but United Russia across Russia. And somewhat successfully, but not very, to be honest, relative to the amount of attention that the regime has given him. And the other thing, I think the biggest concern is that resonates with so many people and is a threat to the regime, is his pounding on corruption again and again and again. I mean, people experience it every day there. And so, showing a 2-hour video of a palace allegedly built by Putin and or his cronies, that hits people where they live. So, I think that's really the bigger issue.
I think we probably have time for one more question. And I'm trying to decide, I apologize to all those whose questions won't get asked because there are a whole slew of really interesting questions here. But Allison Goldman has asked, how can the West, and more specifically the United States, break down the against the West attitude? Or how can we approach that in terms of diplomacy?
Okay, I got some ideas there. So, one of the things that was quite successful in the 2008 to 12 period was, opening up more person-to-person exchanges. Or I don't think that the current regime in Russia is going to want to do that because in an official capacity. But if it is true in terms of what some surveys are indicating, that 18 to 24-year-olds in Russia, something like 53% of them in the fall of 2019 indicated they intended to emigrate, to leave. That's a super bad sign for the longevity of Putin's system, right, domestically. Because if your young people want to go, then where's your future as a country? So let's make it easier for them to come to the United States or to Western Europe. I mean, that's something, just make it easier to emigrate or to spend 2 or 3 or 5 years here. Look at the creativity that Russian immigrants have brought to the US in the past. I'm sitting in Silicon Valley. Think about Google, right? That family came here and we have Google. Russia doesn't have Google, we do. So why not make that easier in terms of immigration policy and capture those folks who want to come here? And if they go back to Russia, fine, they'll go back with understandings of how hopefully the US system functions when it does function, and new ideas that they may not be exposed to in Russia, and they'll take those home. Long term, that's good for us and that's good for them too. So that's one of many, many things we can do, but I think making it easier to have some sort of work visa to come here and also to go to Germany, even for apprenticeships. There is a whole and this I can finish on. One of the big threats to the regime and why it was so worrisome with Navalny, that it was particularly young people out on the streets. There were older folks too, but there were a lot of young people who had been quite passive until about 2016, 17. Why? Well, they're frustrated that they can't get into a university because they don't have the right connections. Not that doesn't happen here, but there it's even harder because there's no transparency. There's nothing you could do about it, right? And this is very problematic for Putin. They don't know any other leader, and increasingly, if they don't see opportunity in their own country, why don't they have another leader? Why don't they have these choices? Why isn't it easier to gain access to the rest of the world? So I think that is worrisome and problematic with the generational change.
Well, Kathryn, thank you.
Sorry, that's my Siri for some reason.
That happens to me all the time. Well, usually when I say words like serious and things like that, but thank you so much, Kathryn. Seriously, for all of your insights. I wish we could have gone through all of the questions that remain in the Q&A. But on behalf of everyone, I think we had more than 100 people at one point. I would like to thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm sure that everyone who hasn't already gone out and bought the book is scurrying over to there. However, they get their books.
Mine don't walk. Right.
Mine's on the Kindle already. So, just an alert to everybody, there are lots of events coming up, some of which have been organized by the American Foreign and Military Policy Research Cluster. Our next event is a discussion with Dr. Cynthia Burak on US support for LGBTI rights abroad from Obama to Trump. That's on March 25th at 4 p.m. There's a wonderful conference that the cluster has co-sponsored along with the East Asian Studies Center. The cluster is supporting this conference on April 14th, Divided America, Divided Korea, US-Korean relations during and after the Trump years. We have many more things after that, but it is after 5 p.m. So I will wrap things up. But again, Kathryn Stoner, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us and your insights on Russia Resurrected. And I'll send you an email with my questions as well.
Yeah,
so
please do. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.